Welcome back, dear listener, to Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers, the podcast devoted to exploring the frontiers of psychedelic medicine and what it takes to cultivate a healthy mind, body, and spirit. As always, Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus. I'm Dr. Steve Thayer, and today my co-host, Dr. Reid Robison, and I discuss adult development. That's right, folks. Developmental stages aren't just for the kids. In today's episode, Reid and I will explore different theories on adult development. We spend a lot of time particularly with Ken Wilber's integral theory and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We talk a bit about our own approaches to personal development in adulthood and how we help our clients on this journey. We'll also discuss the phenomenon of the so-called midlife crisis. Talk about waking up versus growing up, how to zero in on your values and live life according to those values, and much, much more. If you've ever listened to an episode of Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers and thought to yourself, I wonder where I can find good training on how to use psychedelics in a clinical practice. Well, wonder no longer. Numinus has several excellent psychedelic therapy training programs. If you want to learn more, you can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/our-training-selection, and you can use the code PTF10 for 10% off selected trainings. If you've listened to the show for a while, you've heard Reid and I talk about psychedelic clinical trials, the work we do here at Numinus. If you or someone you know is interested in being a participant in a psychedelic clinical trial, you can click on the link in the show notes or go directly to numinus.com/research to learn more. If you'd like to support the show, you can do so by leaving us a rating and review. We really appreciate those ratings and reviews. Thank you to those of you who have already done it. Without further ado, here is our episode today on adult development. Reid, how you doing on this fine fall afternoon?
It is a fine fall afternoon. I'm doing well. Thanks, Steve. How about you?
I'm good. Yeah. For those of you watching on YouTube, you can see out Reid's window, and it looks beautiful out there. There's
been the same Mercedes parked in the same spot the last few times we've recorded.
Yeah, it's definitely not mine or yours, but I think it's a fine fall afternoon. I'm glad we're recording today, and I'm glad we're talking about this particular topic because it's something I know you and I think about a lot, both just because it has a lot of personal relevance, but also professional relevance for what we do. And that is this notion of development, but especially development in adulthood.
Yeah, we learn about child development in undergrad and in training programs, but I think less attention is paid to adult development, which, for some strange reason, we've all just kind of adopted this notion that, the kid and teenage brain finishes developing at this age, and then we're all just a mess figuring out, and there's not a great framework for that, or hasn't been, but that's what we're going to talk about today, because I think out of necessity, we've had to play around with a lot of frameworks and doing our own work, working with clients.
Yeah, we're all just a mess figuring it out. I think a lot of people could probably relate to that statement.
Relatable.
In adulthood, just trying to find our way, wandering through the wilderness. And like you said, we learn a lot in school as psychology professionals about child development. And of course, we've talked a lot about child development and the implications for things that happen during developmental stages, for what happens to us later in life, the way we develop our personality traits, the presence or absence of self-defeating patterns, psychopathologies, whatever. But there's a lot left on the table if we ignore adult development.
And a lot of different theories out there and stages of development, even though, and maybe this is why it's less taught, not a generally accepted framework. But what's interesting is this idea that psychology has a problem, right? And I'm interested what your thoughts are. But the subjective nature of reality and all the forces at play that go into our mood states and anxiety and everything else, what we're left with in this, how old is the field technically? 150 years or so formally. But you would have the psychodynamic folks saying, strengthen the ego. And you'd have the Buddhists saying dissolve or eradicate it. And these were at odds, but I think 150 years later, we're starting to reconcile those paradoxes, if you will.
I think so.
Yeah.
Especially the corner of psychology that you and I like to play around in. Because I think, there are a variety of crises that modern psychological theory and science face. One of them is a replication crisis in a lot of our studies, right? We've tried to apply the scientific method to the human condition. We've discovered that the human condition doesn't submit very well to the scientific method, at least not in the ways that some of other disciplines do. And part of that's just because what we're trying to measure, what we're trying to operationalize so that it can be measured, are things that are very subjective.
Yeah.
And a lot of times the windows into those very subjective things are just self-report, for example. So we take response items on questionnaires and we try to use lots of really advanced statistical analysis to tease out what the correlating factors are, what they might predict, what they might not predict, to give us things like traits or clusters of symptoms, personalities, things like that.
And what we're left with is this huge collection of possible tools you can use as interventions in mental health that are often at odds with one another. And you have these specialized clinicians coming out of their training that's largely dictated by where they trained, who their teachers were and their mentors, and what they gravitated towards, what alphabet soup of therapy tools, but they don't have to be at odds, and I think that's part of what we'll talk about. But another thing you mentioned, I think, is really important, of this idea of what is truth. And some truths are testable and others less so. Like an example that I heard recently was the debate between Sam Harris and Dan Dennett on free will versus determinism. Do you remember watching that? Like, this has been 5-10 years ago.
Yeah.
But they were good friends, and then they had this falling apart publicly, like writing books, criticizing each other's books, and then they agreed to have this public conversation. And the thing about truth is that those kind of truths, like, is there a God, or what is consciousness, or the things like is it free will or determinism? There's not one right answer, and it lands on us as individual humans based on if it feels true for us, and that is determined by all of our life experiences that we've had in our bodies throughout our lives, right? So at the end of that debate, I think the most wise thing that was said in the whole thing was when Sam Harris said, just at the end, well, I guess your intuition and my intuition are different on the matter. And just kind of accepting that. And so, because if you can't prove each other's perspective, then, we still should, in my opinion, seek to understand each other. And there's huge value in that when you're in a relationship, when you're in war, when you're having a debate about politics or God. And that in large part comes from just trying to see the world through multiple different perspectives.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm glad you brought up Sam and Dennett. Like, I've been following Sam's work for a long, long time, and I'm sure I won't be able to characterize it accurately, but he fascinates me because he seems like somebody who, prioritizes empirical investigation and what can be measured as a source of truth. Right, his epistemology is oriented that way, how to acquire knowledge and develop knowledge, and how to investigate the ontological realities of the world. But he also writes and speaks very opinionatedly about morality and consciousness and, a secular spirituality.
What it means in the world, not just like spiritual concepts for our inner world.
Right.
Which I think is so important. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm glad to hear. I don't remember the details of that conversation, but I'm glad to hear. It's just interesting to hear Sam talk about intuition, and what I imagine some of the things he might say about what intuition is, given what he thinks about consciousness and determinism and free will. But this is something that has sort of perturbed my mind since I was a teenager. Like, what is the nature of reality? What is the nature of truth? How do we get a grasp on it? And eventually, finding my mind arriving at the conclusion that it is, and this could be totally wrong, but it just seems all subjective, given that we can't escape the lens through which we view the world, and everyone's lens is different, and it's shaped by their genetics, it's shaped by their experiences relative to the environment that they grow up in, the relationships that they grow up in, the things that they're taught, the governments under which they live, right?
Yeah,
the privileges or lack thereof that they have. So as a psychologist trying to help people who suffer, who struggle, this has always been at the foundation or in the background of the way I approach, given our topic today, adult development. Like, how do we create the good life? What is the good life? And how do we get a hold of the things that prevent us from living a good life?
Yeah.
And what are normal? What are the normal stages or cycles of development that we can all relate to?
Yeah, and maybe to try and summarize those beyond all the individual theories that we could dive into. I mean, there's, most of us underestimate how powerful culture is on our thoughts and therefore our reality. And, we're all in this evolution, personally, individually, and society's evolved too, which is really interesting to look at. And so we come into the world in this, like, you might call it an egocentric stage, or you're a baby and it's all about you, your needs, understandably. It's cute and all that. And maybe it's about you, mommy, daddy. But then, later in life, that's maybe outwardly focused. Libido comes, interestingly, puberty, hormones, and an outward accomplishment-focused approach to the world. And then there's often kind of a wake-up call that isn't the answer, but like a door opening, and people start to question their beliefs, like that the world is not just what's outside. There's an inner world and all these influences that we've had throughout our life. And then hopefully, ideally, as things progress, a shift towards a more giving, fulfilling, meaningful existence of how you show up in the world consistent with your values. And that's it. I think it's really helpful to look at with a big picture lens, because it can feel so uncomfortable at times in our life, or confusing, but we are changing big time.
Yeah, I think that's a good summary. And I think we could plug a lot of the stages of development and the theories that are out there into kind of that broader picture. As you were talking, it made me think of Erik Erikson's stages of development, which I wrote down because I don't have them memorized, but he's got his 8 stages of development, and I'll just list them off for fun. Starting at infancy to about year and a half, 2 years old, trust versus mistrust. Then you move into autonomy versus shame and doubt, initiative versus guilt. This is preschool years here. Industry versus inferiority. And, these are not exactly face valid self-explanatory labels here. So if you're interested, folks, you could Google Erik Erikson. But then we're getting into later teen years with identity versus confusion, kind of like you were talking about, like, as a late teenager, we're figuring out who we are. We're experimenting with who we are. We're getting feedback from our social environment. We're shifting our perspective from, parents to social, to peers. Then you've got young adulthood with intimacy versus isolation. And then, I'm interested in this stage, I guess, because I'm approaching it, if not in it. And this is generativity versus stagnation, like you were talking about, giving back. And
that's stuck with me since early, like, psychology exposure in college, like that one. And I love that concept. And you see it in the wise mentors we've all had.
I also see a lot of my clients grappling with that. I've noticed, a lot of times that the type of clients that I get as I advance through my career, and the kind of people I'm like reaching out to and trying to help, or I'm often in a parallel process with. So a lot of times they're pretty close to me in age, not all the times, of course, but and I'm sort of helping them from 1 or 2 steps up on the stairs, where I am compared to where they are. Maybe that's one way to think about it. But yeah, I've given a lot of thought to that idea of generativity versus stagnation, and this desire not to feel stagnant, but not to confuse that with this need for ambition and accumulation and proving or protecting, those kinds of things.
Yeah, and it's a couple disclaimers come to mind that might be useful before we dive in too deep on these rabbit holes is, one is that these stages are just frameworks, and every individual is so different, and they're often more overlapping than we think. And they may even be cycles of stages that many people have to go through more than once. Like you can have more than one midlife crisis, for example.
And it doesn't have to happen midlife.
Yeah. And so there's a little story I want to tell on midlife crisis, but the other disclaimer is well, practice matters. Like the only way to know these wiggly truths, as Alan Watts might call them, is to try them on and check in with how it lands for you and your intuition. One of my kind of yoga teachers who I never met because he's passed on, but Patabi Joyce, founder of kind of Ashtanga yoga from Mysore, India, would say, practice and all is coming. Or he would say, the yoga practice is 99% practice, 1% theory. And it reminds me of kind of what we're talking about, what we've learned in therapy in recent years of you have to engage the body to do trauma work because there are labyrinths of the mind you can get stuck in. It's just one thing. It's one thing to intellectually understand something, but that has nothing on an embodied experience. It's like in AI and cognitive science, the symbol grounding problem of like the concern that AI robots don't have the same moral or ethical boundaries, and if they just view every human as just a line of code and haven't had a multisensory embodied experience of anything, then it would be fine for them to eradicate lines of code, for example. Or another example would be you could know the chemical structure of a blueberry, all the chemical functions, but if you've never tasted it, you have no idea what it's like or if you like it, for example.
Right. Yeah, you haven't had that lived experience of blueberry. That's very different data.
Yeah. But on the midlife crisis front, it's actually this book for those on video. I'll hold it up. Psychotherapy and Spirit by Brant Courtwright, that I just kind of a random one I found and have used a lot through the years in transpersonal work. But in there, it talks about Michael Washburn, not that well-known philosopher Jungian who wrote a couple of books, but he talks about the midlife crisis as somewhat of a hero's journey where, like, in the first half of your life, your ego emerges from this collective unconscious. Like you don't know you're an individual as a baby. You're part of your mother, your parents, if you will. And then as it starts to engage in the outside world, towards the end of that stage, there's what we were talking about, the libido towards, others, like reproducing and whatever, and towards accomplishment. And we're getting more and more out of touch with our inner archetype of that true self. But then as that starts to recede, and diminish throughout your life, the outward focus, you're like, wait a minute, is this what life really is? And you turn inward, and that second stage is more of like, oh, I have an inner world and I have consciousness, and there's all this subjectivity and all these beliefs. I'm not actually my beliefs, and they may actually change. And it's like an individuation process back to that archetypal self, but back to that baby state, if you will, of unity. But now you have the experience of life that you have to integrate, which is not easy work, into it. It's kind of, he calls it regression in the service of transcendence. And so then comes the dark night. Dark night of the senses is what one book, like St. John of the Cross, called it in a book called Dark Night, but where it's like a purge of your psyche, a purification process, where there's loss of meaning, pleasure. You're like, oh shit, old satisfactions no longer seem gratifying. You're confronted with your own shadow, forbidden thoughts, feelings, like your underworld, your darkness, everything. And then eventually comes in this stage, in whatever form for each person, a waking up experience that some, like the New Age spirituality would say, that's what it's all about. That's what you need. But this is actually just the sign, the door opening of the work, and not enough in and of itself unless you do the growing up we're talking about, the cleaning up. And so then through that like dark night, the depression, you're sinking into a black hole, swallowed by the belly of a beast like Jonas. These are metaphors for it. You're abandoned by, like even Jesus, why God has thou forsaken me? And all your early object relations come on board. You have to face them. You're angry at people, all these feelings that, you know, you thought you shouldn't, couldn't, wouldn't have. Your ego's vulnerable. Going back to these old places, and this could be for any individual a very different duration depending on your spiritual anchors, right? It could be years, and it's not just an ordeal, but like this purification process, and why I like having frameworks, especially those that land as good and useful for you, or the more you can understand and embrace it, the more you can surrender to it, the faster you move through a process like this. And that is like the key, I think, to kind of developing is, really signing on to the process and surfing the waves of those in whatever skillful way you can.
Yeah. Well articulated, Reid. And I think just as I was listening to you articulate all that, it does seem like, as you said, having a framework that makes this process at least feel like it makes some sense, or there is, that other people might have gone through something similar, or that there is something to be done, even if what is to be done is to submit and surrender, can really help people a lot. I mean, I have had clients come to me in some sort of form of the dark night, and just really want some assurance, some reassurance, some comfort, some perspective that this is a thing, and they're going through.
They're not alone.
Right.
There might be a little hope. Like we might be arbingers of hope as a primary role in some of these situations, right? And it can be life or death. Like when someone feels like at rock bottom and like there is no way out, having some kind of spiritual anchor or life preserver to hang on to, and that can be life-saving. Yeah. Yeah.
And if you feel yourself bristle at the word spiritual, just, which I have certainly done at various points in my own particular dark nights and adult development, at least the way I think of spiritual lately is less about a relationship to the Judeo-Christian God, for example, or adherence to any particular religious dogma. For me, it's a relationship to the great mystery. It's a relationship to whatever I am at my core. It's a reverence and an awe for the unsolvable. And the things that transcend the sort of self-contained ego that maybe you were describing earlier. And for me, like my little nods here to mystery and awe and unknowable are how I stay a little oriented, and not panic so much. Like I don't need to know exactly what to do next, or what the nature of reality is, or what the nature of I am. Like what is my specific, really well-defined nature in order to feel some hope enough to keep going.
Yeah. And then that thing you mentioned about trying to figure everything out, that's another thing I've noticed that's highlighted through these and common across these different theories of development is, in the middle of your life, you might be trying to get the answers to everything. Yeah. And then later in life, as we mature, as we wake up and grow up, we start to realize that we don't have all the answers and it's okay. And you start to just like live the question and give up the fight to understand and solve everything. Yeah.
I like that. Maybe it would be useful if we talked about the difference between waking up and growing up for a few seconds. I mean, do we get that from Ken Wilber's integral theory? That's the first time I had seen those words used in that way, like the difference between waking up and growing up.
Yeah, Ken Wilber is a fascinating fella, right? He is the founder of this modern interpretation of integral theory. There's some like older underpinnings that we could talk about, but he's a brilliant intellectual, and I've since come to realize more than that. Like he's really practiced a lot of this stuff, but and his teachings are hard for many, myself included, to decipher. They're pretty dense. We were just talking before. I think you shared that as well. That when I read Ken Wilber stuff, I need to have a pen and paper handy, but I keep coming back. It's been like something I've been soaking up for the past decade. But he wrote his first book when he was 23, like called The Spectrum of Consciousness. Could you imagine at age 23?
Could not have written such a book at age 23.
But interestingly, like why he came up with this is one way he's answered that is he wrote this fiction book called Boomeritis? A novel that will set you free. Okay, interesting, right? 2002. And in that he said that if millennials, those born after 1980 roughly, do not become aware of some kind of meta theory or integrative approach to all these dueling theories, then they will go crazy. Why? Because that's a really anxiety-provoking sense of self in relation to the world, and sometimes you need, like we're saying, that bigger philosophy to hold on to make some meaning of it.
Yeah. Well, as an elder millennial myself, I think I found myself going a little crazy, searching for basically this, for what he calls integral theory, the idea that, and it's a little bold, but
it is.
That basically his theory is like, this is a theory of everything. Right. He has researched and thought about and tried to integrate knowledge from Eastern, Western philosophies of thought, from religious ideology, from modern science, from neuroscience, from psychology, from ethics and morals, and which is why his theory is so dense, because it's so comprehensive.
Yeah.
But in that density, I'm always, as I read him, and I'm not as familiar with him as you are, but I'm seeing like some of those bright lines, like, oh, okay, he actually is bringing some of these things together in a satisfying way. It just feels really, really unwieldy sometimes. Yeah.
And what I like about his approach is, he does critique without critiquing that, like, New Age focus on waking up only, for example, but in a very inclusive way. Like his big quote that I think sums it up well is this saying, transcend and include. Like, rather than kick out all the old beliefs of this evolutionary game we're in, he says, integrate them all, know how to work with them individually and in society collectively. And that's the way to not go crazy.
Yeah. I like that. So, to wake up is to transcend something. Like, it's to wake up to the non-dual nature of consciousness, of our oneness with each other and the universe. It's to wake up to this sort of silly meat machine that we're piloting in this weird corporeal existence. But, like you said, and maybe like he says, if you just sort of wake up and stay there, then, to use a phrase I used earlier, you're leaving a lot on the table in terms of actually living the life that you're in. You might come to the realization that you're just this spirit molecule floating throughout this infinite universe, but you still have your laundry to do. You still have your friends and family to interact with. You have something to do while this body still exists on this planet.
Yeah, I was sitting on that couch the other day in a kind of a catch-up meeting with someone, and they asked me a question I thought was pretty funny. It's like, Reid, are you enlightened? And
of course I am.
It's a funny one, and you and I both have probably these like really humble reactions to it, and a very kind of also informed by working with a lot of humans over the years, reverence for how we all are awake in moments and asleep in other moments, right? And but the interesting thing about enlightenment is that I've always kind of thought for years is it's this radical change in perspective, like a turning the lights on or adding more perspectives, but those can be just moments, like a moment of awakening, and it can be long gone and not really change who you are, how you show up in the world, or it can turn into a completely new worldview and way of being.
Yeah, well said. And I think when people have asked me that question, my answer is no. I'm not enlightened in probably the way you're thinking to ask the question. Like, I have had moments of being enlightened about a thing, or I've had certainly, like Wilber talks about, these ecstatic or transcendent experiences one might experience, like on a psychedelic, for example, as a waking up experience. Yeah. It's a state. It's not a stage. It's not somewhere you set up shop and live, right? It's this perspective enhancing, perspective giving, like you said, experience that has shifted my being. It's shifted the way I view myself in the world. But I would not describe myself as enlightened, because I'm constantly humbled by my life. Yeah. and by, other people and the knowledge or the suffering that they share with me. So I don't know that I could ever say with confidence. I can't imagine a version of Steve Thayer who says, yeah, I'm totally enlightened.
And you won't hear enlightened gurus just answer that point blank either. Mm-hmm. If anyone is a fully enlightened guru, I like how one of my yoga teachers would say it, of like, we're all walking around the planet, either awake or asleep or in a state of enlightenment or not. And it's on a spectrum, more likely. And, 99% of the time for most people, we're not really fully in that enlightened state. But there are times when you're just kind of you have self-energy on board. I like the IFS, Internal Family Systems framework of it, because it takes out this black or white enlightened. Yeah. It's like you can have some or a lot of self-energy on board, capital S self, that is in the driver's seat, rather than your individual unenlightened parts that have a role, and we love them and they're useful and all that. Mm-hmm. But that is kind of the way I view it, is trying to have more and more moments where you are more and more in that self-energy or enlightened kind of state, and acknowledging that we're all dipping below that surface and floating above it at different times.
Yeah. I do want to talk more about what self-energy is, and we can talk a bit about values and things like that. But I just remember this. I was listening to Pete Holmes, who's a comedian, really funny, but he wrote a book called Comedy, Sex, God. He's a really thoughtful guy, Ram Dass fan. In fact, he said he met Ram Dass kind of later in life in Hawaii after the stroke, mm-hmm. and he asks Ram Dass, are you my guru? Mm-hmm. And he says, Ram Dass says, yes, now what?
Yeah, I like that.
And for Pete, it was like, oh, like this enlightenment, again, is not this place I go to and set up shop and know I don't have any problems anymore. So people like funny people like him, and we've mentioned Duncan Trussell, these kind of hilarious folks that are on an enlightenment seeking path or a personal development path, are always really fun for me to listen to. But
yeah, I love when people can bring a little comedic flair to the discussion, that's for sure. Yeah. And in fact, those enlightened gurus, if you will, are more likely to answer you in a riddle that's actually quite useful, like the mm-hmm. whole idea of a Zen koan. Mm-hmm. It's like just a question that triggers awakening in some way, mm-hmm. But Ken Wilber's integral theory and all the work that's been done by the growing community of people building on that has some useful, even though complicated, some useful ways of looking at oneself, and does a good job, I think, of breaking our inner and outer worlds down into different categories, knowing that you can develop really rapidly on the intellectual or on the physical prowess front or on some aspects of your even spiritual development, and it's not out of balance, and it's uniquely your trajectory of development. And just because someone has enlightened teaching, say like Osho, right, who wrote some brilliant books on love, but there's also a documentary about kind of the shady, like, money-seeking practices and interrelational messes that he had around him. Yeah. Like
maybe it's possible to be an enlightened psychopath, or mm-hmm. An enlightened. I heard somebody say that this might have been that podcast with Ken Wilber that you sent me with Schmachtenberger or whatever his name is, but an enlightened Nazi.
Yeah.
Again, the difference between waking up and growing up.
Yeah. So I love the focus on our own adult development that includes, yes, our mental health and our physical health and our spiritual well-being, and also, how we take care of each other and the planet.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and Wilber, in my cursory reading of him, he tries to incorporate a lot of those things, not only the spiritual and philosophical, what we know from sort of the modern psychological science and theories, but also like biopsychosocial and some of the limitations of simply looking at, when we're talking about clinicians trying to help people heal or grow or thrive, the limitations of simply biopsycho and social.
Yeah.
It often doesn't include spiritual, for example.
Yeah. And one idea of Ken Wilber's, or way he describes a certain idea that's not that novel, is on moral development. And if we're looking at the stages of how we individually progress through moral development and as a society, if you go way back, there's warrior and tribal phases, but looking mostly at the, what was it? I have it here. The traditional, the modernist, and the postmodern stages of development. In the traditional view, it was more about, traditional view is more about the social conservatism, religion, and then in the modern, it's more science, focused on science and business and keeping the trains running and secular things. And then the postmodern kind of stage of development, and these are overlapping, but the postmodern one is more giving a voice to the oppressed and the social injustices and things like that. And what's I think really useful about looking at these is we start to see that they are all in each of us in one way or another, because of how things are passed through the generations and the impact of culture and the bosom of the family that you're grown into. And I think a lot of people, especially if they're really vocally taking a stance in one of these phases, will try and distance themselves entirely from any influence, but it's kind of like embracing the shadow side that's in all of us. These things are passed on in one way or another through grandparents to parents and us, and they may be these lingering thoughts that are inconsistent with the predominant one that are inside ourselves, but even more than that, it helps us interrelate and understand that oh yeah, these people, if we're talking about the boomers and millennials, for example, these people have very different worldviews, but it's a different time, and it was born at this different time in evolution. And here we are, and how can we have a conversation together that's productive instead of a battle?
Yeah. I guess it's one of the reasons we have labels for certain generations of humans, like boomer or millennial. It's I guess, implicit or maybe explicit acknowledgement of what you were talking about, of how culture and time on the sort of culture and the way that culture and all the factors you listed change over time, impact a person's thinking, impact a person's values, what they prioritize. Well, yeah.
And I realize now that I didn't quite complete a thought about moral development, but moral development for the integral theorists would refer to the sphere of who you think is worthy of moral consideration. And like we were talking about, we can apply these to the phases of egocentric early life, self, babies, me, mommy, daddy, that's it. That's all that matters. And then you're clan-centric through development. Some people might stay stuck there, but only viewing your tribe as worthy of moral considerations. It's actually why, why some would say that we see in the news in the U.S., we only hear about the number of Americans who have died in Iraq, not the number of Iraqis, for example. And then progressing to something that includes all beings, like really like animals, creatures, plants. But it's a process, moral development, a process of learning and evolving. So you may start to realize throughout your life, oh, animals feel pain. Oh, they have emotions. And you have a bond with a pet or something, and then you see a documentary of slaughterhouses of animals or chickens warehoused, cranking out eggs and treated poorly for Walmart to sell. And you have this moment of like, oh no, how could we ever breed an animal to kill? I'm just using this as an example, but so then you either, like, you're changing your beliefs and responding in a way that you decide to, like you might stop eating meat, silent protest it, or I only eat what I kill, or you might chain yourself to a tree or hold picket signs outside of these places. But everyone has a piece of their truth. And what I like about of the truth, and Ken Wilber really focuses on that these are valid feelings and perspectives, and what really matters is trying to listen and understand and integrate that, like kind of like parts work. We were talking about parts work, but sometimes we forget that parts work as a metaphor is looking at the inner parts, but these are based on principles of how we should interact with outer parts too, like no bad parts, and seeking to understand and listening and loving into the light, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, folks, as you listen to Reid go over all that, I just want to name and give reverence to how confusing this can be.
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Again, I know we gave it a nod a second ago. Because as I'm listening to Reid talk, I'm finding myself agreeing, and then I'm also finding
dozing off.
Not quite. No, I'm finding parts of myself objecting. Like, what about this? What about this? I'm a little confused about this. So I think wrapping all of this in a nice warm blanket of compassion is something that I often try to return to. So compassion for myself, compassion for others, also compassion for the parts of me that want to protect me and that want to protect my ideologies from annihilation or change. And it's something I try to be really conscious of in me, and I notice in others. And a lot of people react to that dissonance, to that discomfort, by becoming closed off and dogmatic and really self-protective, and maybe even, persecutory or attacking. And like you referenced, we see a lot of that in the news media. We see that in our friends and family members and in culture at large. And at the risk of sounding like a psychedelic influenced hippie, I think if there is a healthy path forward for our society, it's one motivated by compassion and a willingness to listen and understand.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that if you look at this from a big picture point of view, through an Eastern lens of, say, Hindu and Buddhist philosophy, this took me years to start to understand, but this idea that all suffering comes from the illusion of separation. Like in Hindu philosophy, there's this concept of Maya, this illusion that obscures us from seeing reality as it is. Like we've talked about, we all see things a little differently, but I'm starting to believe that more and more, that if we apply it to these stages, you're born into the world as a baby and a state of unity and pure love and things like that. And understandably, we grow up and interact with the world, get influenced, jaded, but then if we can strip away again the ego's sense of separation that is actually at the root of pretty much any war or conflict out there, because we've forgotten our oneness, our shared humanity. And so I think that's one big picture important reason for like doing this kind of work and doing whatever these practices are, and using whatever framework works for us to get more in tune with our real selves and that same divine spark that's in everyone.
Yeah. So when you say doing this work, would you say that's the work of, of adult development? It's waking up and growing up. It's moving through, stages with integrity. It's having a life perspective that is different based on who you are and the influences that we've talked about. But trying to make the best of whatever metric you use or value or moral compass you use to gauge best. But to do so leaning forward instead of being stagnant or falling back or self-annihilating.
Yeah, like trying to really separate out the influences of this like culturescape, if you will, or these imposed limitations, self-limiting beliefs, all that, and the beliefs that aren't really true to ours that we may have taken on or been born into. So doing the work to find what's really true for you, those values, like you mentioned, and to move your life more in harmony with that. Right?
Yeah. I like the idea of harmony. I've used the metaphor in the podcast before. I use it with my clients a lot. But when I'm talking about personal development, especially in adulthood, I like to think of the human psyche, the human soul, as a musical instrument. And I played the cello in high school growing up. And, it was in the nature of that instrument to fall out of tune because the strings are in tension around pegs that are just sort of jammed in there. Mm-hmm. Usually don't have screws in them to hold them where they are. So we don't get mad at our instrument when it falls out of tune, but it can be really helpful to become an expert at listening to that instrument, knowing when it's out of tune, and then doing what you need to do to calibrate it, right? To bring it back in tune so that you can be in harmony with self, in harmony with the other instruments that you're playing with. And when you become an expert at that, then you have options, you have volition, you have choice, because then you can pick what kind of music to play. And if you're an instrument well-tuned, there's a lot of options for what you can play. But if you're an instrument not well-tuned, it doesn't matter what sheet music you're using, you're not likely to sound very good.
Yeah, I like that analogy a lot. And in fact, I saw that in real life after recently just putting a new string on a guitar and seeing how that string is the one that goes out of tune so much more and so much more quickly than the others. And you start to realize that as you tune yourself more and more, that becomes more efficient and second nature, if you will, to get in that state of attunement.
I like that. I'm going to add that to my metaphor, because when you put a new string on a string instrument and you bring it into tension, that new string will stretch. So if you, and old strings don't stretch as much, right? They're used to being where they are. So
I've snapped them before.
Right? If you stretch them too much, they snap. Man, this metaphor is gold. Because when you're trying on a new way of being or trying on a new skill, we talked about habits a couple episodes ago and making changes stick, that it's very rare for you to sort of put it in there, put that string in tension, and for it to never stretch or fall out of tension. So again, we can make reference back to what I said earlier about self-compassion. If you have an understanding of your development and you have this container of understanding within which all this scary stuff, the dark nights, the hero's journey happen, then you're going to be able to navigate those rough waters. Now I'm mixing metaphors, but navigate those rough waters with more confidence, with more faith, with more hope. Yeah,
I like it. And your question about practices, I also didn't really answer, but I'm realizing that because integral theory can feel so complex and therefore confusing or overwhelming, I think it is important to try and distill it down to what could practice look like, and one way I've seen some people approach that is like of plotting the different areas of development and listing off some practices that support them and taking an inventory of where you're at in these things. There's even something called the psychograph in integral practice that is kind of like the psychological assessments we do, but it includes a lot more spiritual and other parts of life, and it might plot where you're at a given point in time across 10 areas. But if you look at like these core areas of practice would be like body, mind, spirit, and shadow, those four. And then other ones that are ancillary supporting ones like ethics, your intimacy, your work, your emotions, your broader relationships. And then if you would if you want to work on these, like at least the core things, pick one practice from a given module and try it, and really try it enough days or weeks to give it a chance. Like for the body, it might be adopting some kind of body-based practice for joyful movement or just being able to function and flourish in life. And for mind, there's so much there, but like the meditation, attention training, the reading and study, and then spirit, whatever your spiritual practices are of inquiry or meditation, worship, devotion, nature, whatever, and doing some shadow work, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I like to think of that process sometimes in terms of the scientific method, just to sort of take the pressure off of myself, meaning that I start with a theory, like I think this is how the world works, or I think that if I try this thing, I might feel better or do better. And so I have a theory, and I'm not particularly attached one way or the other. I try not to be. And then I go out and test a hypothesis based on that theory. So you mentioned the practice, right? Like trying something on for a week or two or even longer, and then collecting data. And if we're really trying to be a true scientist about it, when we collect data, we're trying to be mindful of and control for our biases so that we look at the data as purely as possible, knowing that we can't help but be biased. But as much self-awareness as possible you bring to that process. And then you calibrate life, you tune your instrument, I guess, based on the data, based on what you collect, what you observe, what you experience.
Yeah, like we've talked about a time or two on here about doing trigger work, like what in the last week has activated you, and what did you do with that? Was there a time when you were able to look back and reflect on it and see how you reacted and do something like we've talked about, like a process of emotional self-exploration? When's the earliest? Where does that hysterical reaction come from? Because when it's a hysterical reaction, it's historical. And how might I add some self-awareness, understanding, compassion by seeing the origins of these kind of uncomfortable things that keep showing up in our lives when someone hits our buttons, but then doing that kind of practice makes it second nature, and you can almost do it in real time and pause the maladaptive reactions before they unfold and you get in trouble again for your road rage or whatever.
Right. Yeah, I like that. That process you're describing, I imagine as a cycle with epicycles. So we got this spiral of life that we're on. And for those of you not watching, I'm just like twirling my finger as a spiral upward. And so we hope that we're spiraling upward toward transcendence or, the good life or whatever it is. And there are these broad loops that include different phases and stages of life, certain experiences. And then along that loop are these epicycles, right? Like the trigger work. Like, I got triggered again. What's that about? So I contemplate, I develop awareness. I use those practices to develop more understanding and insight. And if I can keep doing those little epicycles in a way that is healthy and that is true to self, then I continue this progress of an upward spiral. And sometimes I like to, this is even on my website, I like to think of this process as one of these cycles as a process of descending first. Like we got to go down into and do the shadow work.
The underworld.
Got to get a sense for our triggers, follow those trailheads down into the inside, into the past. Then once we've descended and done some work, we can then begin to ascend, right? Out of that pit on the hero's journey, return with gifts and insight we can give to others, clarify our values. And then after we've ascended, maybe we can transcend and integrate, right? Transcend and integrate, like you said earlier, with respect to Ken Wilber's book, or his writing. But that is not a one and done process. That is not the process. Again, it's more of an epicycle along this more general, broad spiral upward. So forgive the rant, but
I like the rant and the spiral analogy. In fact, last time we talked about eating disorders, and in eating disorders, there's this commonly taught thing that the recovery process is not linear. It's more of a spiral. And in integral theory, for example, over the years, Ken Wilber has adopted spiral dynamics concepts in there to really apply these stages of development to that kind of spiral geometry as well.
Yeah, I'll admit when I've looked at spiral dynamics before, it feels as difficult to grasp as as integral theory, but
Yeah.
generally. But yeah, there's some gold in there for sure. And I just love the general concept of the spiral upward, like you said. I can make use of it. You know, it's orienting for me. Another one is Maslow's hierarchy. This is one that a lot of people will be familiar with. And I've mentioned this book before, but Scott Barry Kaufman's book Transcend is a revisit where he revisits Maslow's work and builds on it. You know, Scott's a scholar of Maslow, really, and has done a lot of empirical work himself on, you know, positive psychology and related topics. But he sort of recontextualizes the pyramid. He asserts that Maslow never implied for his work to be put in sort of a stage-wise pyramid that people ascend.
He wanted a spiral, damn it.
Yeah, that's why I wanted a spiral. So Scott comes up with this alternative metaphor of a sailboat. And you should Google it if you want to see it, or get his book Transcend. But he's got this sailboat, the hull of which is down in the water, and in the water is security, right? We have to have this strong hull that carries us through what might be dangerous. So of the security needs, he has safety, connection, and self-esteem.
The bottom of the pyramid.
Yep. And then at the top, the air is growth. So we have security, then growth, and part of the sail of the sailboat that carries us through life, this ocean of waves, is exploration, love, and what's the last one? Purpose.
Nice.
And then above all that is the wide open sky of transcendence. So I just think it's a fun metaphor. And of transcendence, I just pulled this from his book. He says, the need for transcendence goes beyond individual growth and allows for the highest levels of unity and harmony with oneself and with the world. Transcendence, which rests on a secure foundation of both security and growth, is a perspective in which we can view our whole being from a higher vantage point with acceptance, wisdom, and a sense of connectedness with the rest of humanity. So you can see the parallels with what you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, and I like the boat analogy. I've heard that applied to integral theory, transpersonal theory as well. Of it gives you kind of a broad worldview and ontology to see what boat you're stuck in, meaning like challenging your cultural beliefs, about what is sacred and important to you, to get more into that big mind, wise mind perspective that integrates everything, transcending that stuck lane you're in. But you got to see it first. Awareness is half the battle.
Which is one of the reasons I think slowing down and engaging in contemplative practices is so crucial to adult development, because of how crucial awareness is. Otherwise, as Jung said, and as we like to quote often, unless you make the unconscious conscious, it'll dictate your life and you'll call it fate. And I wonder about the things that I've called fate, or that I'm currently calling fate. That's just the way I am. That might not just be the way I am. They might be some conditioning or social programming or karma or a part of myself that isn't core self that's sort of running the show or steering the boat, I guess. Yeah.
And there are subconscious forces at play in all of us all the time, right? I mean, what is it like? We have 80,000 some odd thoughts a day, and 90+% of them beneath the general level of our awareness.
Makes me think of that old metaphor to explain Freud's theory of personality, where it's the iceberg, right? And most of the iceberg is beneath the level of awareness, subliminal, subconscious.
Yeah, and if you think of enlightenment as a radical change in perspective or adding to your perspective, you can see how like just getting more worldviews or integrating different philosophies and theories can be helpful. It's kind of like, if you've seen those 3D scanners, I actually sat in one once. Well, I did a headstand in one once. I had to hold it for 2 minutes or something while this scanner just whizzed around me, and then it'll 3D print you or whatever.
I think that would have put me in the hospital. Headstand for 2 minutes.
But it's like if you, anyone I've known who has gone on a trip to India, for example, or pick a lot of different places. They've come back changed in some way of their worldview and beliefs, more so from that week than any other week they've had in a long time. And it's because you got kind of a radical additional perspective. Like if you're looking at a thing from in front of it versus looking at it from in front and the side and every angle around it, like when we accept the perspectives of others, not accept them, but like hear them, try to understand them in debates, that's when we have more of, I guess you could call it an enlightened or broad perspective, informed view that can be so helpful.
Yeah, I love this notion of perspective and view. Like, and we have fun examples of this in cognitive neuroscience, right? Or you have a picture of something and you look at it and your first impression is this is a woman's face.
Yeah.
And then, you're primed to look at it differently, and all of a sudden you see something different in the image. It pops out. Or, if I were to look at this piece of paper from one plane, it would look like a very thin line. And if I didn't change my perspective, I wouldn't see that it's actually a broad, flat sheet of paper. And maybe I'm having an argument with somebody who's sitting to my left and they're seeing this broad sheet of paper and I'm seeing this thin line.
It's a vase. No, it's a vase.
Right, exactly. It's a duck. No, it's a woman.
It's a gold dress.
Right. Yeah, I forgot about the dress thing. Yeah. So just
humans.
Again, important to plumb those depths of the subconscious. And for me, my trip to India was not a trip to India. It was, I've had a lot of sort of, I guess, so-called trips to India, but psychedelics as mind manifestors, as tools to plumb and explore the subconscious have been incredibly important for me.
Yeah, perspective.
They are. We've even called things like ketamine chemical perspective. But back to our conversation about waking up and growing up, we're often find ourselves talking about on this podcast the importance of not, mistaking the altered state of consciousness as sort of what you want to be like or cultivate in daily life, right? It's a perspective granting tool so that you can live life in a way that is more in alignment with your values.
Yeah. So how do you help people find their values?
Well, there's lots of practical tools, like
value
a
card
values
sorting,
card sorter, just showing them a list of values. Or sometimes I'll have them do it a little what feels like upside down or backwards, and I'll say, describe to me what you spend most of your time doing. Describe to me what you spend most of your time thinking. And I can kind of tell you where your values are currently. Again, it's a rough estimate. It's not going to be pretty accurate, based on, where you point your lantern of consciousness and what you spend most of your time doing. And if people are experiencing a lot of dissatisfaction and dissonance and distress and dread, it might be because the values that they're living in service of are not the values that their core self really, really has. So part of the transformation process, the adult development process, the healing process, is discarding ways of being that are in service of values that really, really aren't in alignment with who you really are. So that's one way I go about it. Yeah,
because as you do that work, whatever approach you're taking, you start to see some ways you're spending time or things you're doing in life that aren't in line with your values. And you're like, oh no, how did I get here? But I like to sometimes have people free write a little bit on questions like, who am I? What do I desire? What do I know? And like, it might take a while of writing, who am I? You're writing simple roles and things, but then it tends to get deeper and deeper as you just dig. And then also having people make a list of like things I know because I experienced it in one column, things I know because someone told me it's so. And just like, it's an interesting thing to take an inventory of and realize kind of the value of your own experience and some things you can really test and try on in your life or investigate further.
Yeah, I like that. Those are good tools. I think it's also possible for values to change.
Yeah.
And so sometimes a value will change out from underneath us and we don't realize it's changing. And that can lead to a lot of confusion and dissatisfaction. where we're trying to be an older version of ourselves, or a version that is, like I said, changing, maybe just beneath the surface of awareness. And we come into contact with that change when we get frustrated or triggered or whatever. So processes like you're describing might reveal that kind of thing going on. That can be really enlightening.
Yeah. And even yesterday at a research clinic, there was a package addressed to me, but it was some sets of values card sorting tasks that are part of one of the psychedelic studies we're doing, part of the protocol. So I brought one of those home to try out, because I'll do a value card sort on myself every 6 months or so at least. And it is interesting that they're not always the same. And if you save those in your self-reflections and journey, you can look back and see at how are things changing and what are the common themes too, and both matter.
Yeah, and what things aren't changing. Like it's a little sort of intrapsychic factor analysis, right? You're looking at all these different variables to see which clump together, and what kinds of themes can you derive from where they clump together. And you might discover you have, even though your specific values, the specific words on the cards might change, which piles they land in. You might notice that, man, I really do have a pretty consistent value around things like family, or, achievement and growth, or integrity and honesty, or compassion or humor or something like that.
And even on those ones that are consistent, I've realized about myself, and probably applies to many humans, that having the values is one thing, but being able to prioritize them and really give them the time and focus and energy and space in your life that you truly desire takes that effort, the cleaning up and the growing up effort. You could have a wake up of looking at your values and be like, oh yeah. But if I don't take them and put them out in the real world somewhere, like for me, it might be a 3x5 card for a while of just like having that in my pocket. I know I talk about 3x5 cards a lot, but they've just been a tool over the years. But putting things through that filter as you make your decisions and say yes or no to things, or because we're, like we talked about on that habits episode, we are habitual creatures, and we're very prone to distraction and getting pulled in areas that life and the world pull us into that may not be value driven. Yeah, I do something similar. If I have an awareness that I want to investigate, sometimes I'll just set a daily reminder on my phone. Because I'm not an ancient Gen Xer like Reid. I use I'm an elder millennial, and I use technology. I'm just teasing, but that daily reminder will sometimes help just draw my attention to it, and then I'll habituate to that, and I'll almost ignore it, and that's usually a sign like, okay, I need to mix this up a bit to bring it back into awareness. Yeah. Well, Reid, thank you. As usual, we have had a wandering sojourn through this particular topic. Yeah, I hope it's interesting and useful to people. I also acknowledge that it's a bit confusing and complex to talk about, but it's something I love diving into. So thank you, Steve. I'm glad we talked about this today. And if you have any feedback for us, you can always email us, like we always say, or if you're on listening or watching on a platform where you can leave a comment, please do so. We'd love to hear back from you folks. Yeah. See you next time. Thanks, Reid. Psychedelic Therapy Frontiers is brought to you by Numinus, a mental wellness company committed to tackling the global mental health crisis by delivering best-in-class psychedelic-assisted therapies, contributing to the body of primary and clinical psychedelic research, and fostering healing through community connection and social responsibility. You can learn more about Numinus at numinus.com. That's Numinus.com. If you enjoyed the show today and you want to support us, here's how you do it. Rate and review the show on platforms like Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Subscribe to the Numinus YouTube channel, like the videos, and share it. Share the show or clips of the show with someone that you think will enjoy it. The content of this podcast does not constitute medical advice or mental health treatment. Consult with a medical or mental health professional if you believe you are in need of mental health treatment.